Have you ever wondered how a single individual managed to grip power over a superpower for nearly 2 decades, navigating internal upheaval, external warfare, and still projecting an image of unshakable stability? Today, you're going to step inside the cold, calculating mind of Leonid Brezhnev, the man who steered the Soviet Union through one of the most volatile chapters of the Cold War, an era defined by silence, absolute power, and decisions that determined the fate of millions. This isn't just another biography. We're going behind closed doors into the inner workings of Soviet power, uncovering the secrets behind political maneuvers, the high-stakes chess games played with the United States, and how Brezhnev maintained his iron grip even as the empire began crumbling from within. If you want to understand how the most formidable leaders stay on top during turbulent times, and what that reveals about the decisions you face in your own life, this is exactly what you need to see. Do you ever find yourself making hard choices just to maintain stability when everything around you feels like it's falling apart? Have you questioned what it truly means to be in control? Stay with me until the end, because Brezhnev's story might reveal far more about you than you ever expected. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev was born in 1906 in Kamenskoye, an industrial city located in what is present-day Ukraine. His father worked as a metallurgical laborer, while his mother came from a family with both Russian and Ukrainian roots, embodying the ethnic diversity that characterized the Russian Empire during that period. Brezhnev's childhood was shaped by simplicity, yet it was also defined by strong family discipline. From an early age, he was instilled with core values such as hard work, dedication to collective well-being, and unwavering loyalty to the community. During his formative years, Brezhnev demonstrated a notable interest in organization, structure, and orderliness. These qualities distinguished him even among his schoolmates, who recognized his natural inclination towards systematic thinking. He attended a local educational institution that provided both technical training and humanistic education, an opportunity that was relatively uncommon for children from working-class backgrounds at the time. This educational experience connected him deeply with the ideals of progress, social advancement, and collectivism that were beginning to circulate among the popular classes throughout Russia. Rather than being merely a diligent student, Brezhnev was an observant young man who carefully analyzed the social context surrounding him. The inequality, social tensions, and class divisions of the era did not escape his attention. He developed an acute awareness of the disparities that defined the society in which he lived. Kamenskoye, despite its modest size, functioned as an expanding industrial center. It served as a genuine microcosm of the broader transformation occurring throughout Russia during this tumultuous period. Brezhnev's constant exposure to the factory environment provided him with first-hand experience of industrial life. The conversations among workers that he overheard and occasionally participated in gave him an early understanding of class struggle, labor exploitation, and the aspirations of the working masses. This immersion in proletarian life was not accidental. It shaped his worldview in fundamental ways. Unsurprisingly, he developed a strong sense of identification with the proletariat, a connection that would later prove instrumental in shaping his political discourse and ideological positioning. However, it is important to note that during his youth, Brezhnev was not an openly militant figure. He did not seek the spotlight or engage in explicit political activism during these early years. Instead, he preferred attentive silence over overt participation. He was a listener, an observer who absorbed information and analyzed situations before forming conclusions or taking action. The decade of the 1910s brought profound instability to all of Russia, creating widespread uncertainty that affected every social stratum. The Brezhnev family was no exception to these difficulties. Strikes became increasingly frequent as workers demanded better conditions. Food shortages plagued urban centers, making daily survival a challenge for working-class families. Political instability created an atmosphere of anxiety that permeated working-class households throughout the empire. Consequently, Brezhnev grew up in an environment characterized by mounting tension, learning from a very early age to coexist with uncertainty, adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, and navigate through periods of social upheaval. These experiences during his formative years would profoundly influence his later approach to political leadership, particularly his preference for stability, predictability, and cautious decision-making that would come to define his tenure as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution of 1917 impacted Leonid Brezhnev while he was still an adolescent. Its effects were both immediate and profound, reshaping the world he had known. The fall of the Tsarist regime, coupled with the rise of the Bolsheviks, triggered a rupture in the existing family structure and the broader social order of the era. His family, though firmly rooted in the working class, observed with considerable concern the violence and chaos that rapidly took hold across the nation. The promise of a new world came accompanied by severe instability, widespread hunger, and social disintegration. For a young man like Brezhnev, the revolutionary dream carried a real and tangible cost that could not be ignored. The idealistic rhetoric of transformation was tempered by the harsh realities of daily survival. Kamenskoye, his hometown, became a battleground where multiple forces competed for control. Troops loyal to the Tsar clashed with Bolshevik militias. Anarchist groups sought to establish their own vision of social organization. The city transformed into a stage for ideological disputes that frequently turned violent. Daily life became marked by strict rationing of essential goods, pervasive insecurity, and the constant presence of ideological propaganda from competing factions. The school where Brezhnev had been receiving his education was adapted, sometimes forcibly, to align with the new values being promoted by the emerging proletarian state. It was within these transformed educational spaces that Brezhnev had his first direct contact with Marxist-Leninist language, a theoretical framework that was still under construction and being refined through practical application. Education ceased to be a neutral endeavor focused solely on knowledge transmission. It became instead a powerful tool for political mobilization, ideological indoctrination, and the creation of a new Soviet citizen. The emotional impact of the revolution proved to be as significant as the political transformation itself. Brezhnev learned through direct experience that survival in turbulent times required specific qualities. Discretion became essential. Pragmatism offered a path forward when ideological purity could prove fatal. Above all, adaptability emerged as the most valuable trait one could possess. The revolution was not merely a historical event to be studied or commemorated. It functioned as a brutal social filter that eliminated those who were unprepared, ideologically suspect, or simply unlucky. Many of his schoolmates, neighbors, and community members disappeared during this period. Some went into exile, seeking safety in foreign lands. Others were executed for being associated with the wrong political faction or for expressing unpopular opinions. The arbitrary nature of these disappearances left a lasting impression on the young Brezhnev. The promise of social justice attracted a substantial portion of Soviet youth, who embraced the revolutionary cause with genuine enthusiasm. However, Brezhnev appeared less seduced by the idealistic vision being promoted. He seemed instead more attentive to the concrete structure of power that was emerging from the revolutionary chaos. Historical records from this period do not indicate a strong ideological enthusiasm on his part. He was not among those who spoke passionately about the creation of a workers' paradise. He was, first and foremost, an observer who carefully analyzed the shifting dynamics of power. He studied who gained authority, how that authority was maintained, and what behaviors led to survival or destruction. Over time, this strategic posture would facilitate his approach to the Bolshevik elite without arousing suspicion or hostility. Unlike the passionately committed revolutionaries who often burned brightly but briefly, Brezhnev learned to assert himself through stability, reliability, and calculated loyalty. He understood that in a revolutionary environment where today's hero could become tomorrow's enemy, the appearance of steady competence offered the best path to long-term survival and advancement. Leonid Brezhnev joined the Communist Party in 1931, at a time when Stalin's dominance had already become firmly consolidated throughout the Soviet Union. He was not a passionate revolutionary driven by ideological fervor. He was not a distinguished theorist capable of contributing original ideas to Marxist-Leninist doctrine. Instead, he presented himself as a disciplined technician, someone focused primarily on obtaining concrete results and fulfilling assigned tasks. Initially, he worked within the regional bureaucracy, concentrating his efforts on key sectors such as agriculture and heavy industry. These areas constituted fundamental pillars of the Soviet project, essential to the regime's ambitious plans for rapid industrialization and collectivization. His educational background in metallurgy provided him with practical knowledge that proved valuable in industrial contexts. His hands-on experience made him useful to the party apparatus. However, his technical expertise did not position him as a potential threat to those in positions of higher authority. Throughout the 1930s, a period when the Stalinist purges systematically eliminated veteran political cadres across all levels of the party hierarchy, Brezhnev demonstrated a remarkable ability to maintain a posture of absolute fidelity to the regime. He avoided drawing excessive attention to himself, while simultaneously ensuring that his loyalty remained visible to those who mattered. Many of his direct superiors were arrested under fabricated charges. Some were executed after show trials. Others simply disappeared into the Gulag system, never to return. Yet Brezhnev remained in place. He stayed discreet, efficient, and perpetually ready to replace those who fell victim to the purges. His political survival during this extraordinarily dangerous period serves as compelling evidence of his pragmatic instinct. It demonstrates his refined ability to navigate internal conflicts without becoming entangled in factional disputes that could prove fatal. He did not distinguish himself through impassioned speeches that might attract unwanted scrutiny. He did not engage in ideological debates that could be later used against him. Rather, he fulfilled orders quietly, methodically, and without complaint. He was a natural executor of policy, not a visionary who might threaten the established order with new ideas. During the Great Purge, which reached its peak intensity between 1936 and 1938, Brezhnev managed to ascend even more rapidly within the party machinery. The systematic elimination of senior officials created vacancies that needed to be filled quickly. Brezhnev's reputation for reliability made him an ideal candidate for promotion. His appointment as regional secretary in Dnipropetrovsk marked a significant turning point in his political trajectory. It was in this industrial region that he constructed a network of loyal allies who would become known as the Dnipropetrovsk Mafia. This informal group of officials, bound together by personal loyalty and mutual interest, would accompany him throughout his entire career, eventually forming the core of his support base when he reached the pinnacle of Soviet power. Brezhnev was learning through experience that survival in the USSR constituted an art form, requiring constant attention and careful calculation. Prosperity, meanwhile, represented a science that demanded understanding the unwritten rules governing Soviet political life. In the subsequent years, he was transferred to other strategically important regions, including Zaporizhia and Kursk. In each location, he supervised factories, monitored the implementation of 5-year plans, and organized campaigns for labor mobilization. His capacity to manage complex projects under intense pressure distinguished him from the typical average bureaucrat who merely pushed papers without achieving tangible results. Brezhnev demonstrated competence in coordinating multiple moving parts, meeting production quotas, and maintaining worker discipline. Nevertheless, he never attempted to stand out excessively or claim personal credit for successes that could be attributed to the party collectively. He consistently reinforced his carefully cultivated image as a loyal servant of the party. He presented himself as someone who sought no personal glory, only the opportunity to serve the socialist cause. This carefully maintained persona protected him from the envy and suspicion that often proved fatal to more ambitious or charismatic officials. With the onset of the Second World War and the German invasion in 1941, the Soviet Union found itself compelled to mobilize not only soldiers for the front lines, but also experienced administrators capable of managing the complex demands of total war. Brezhnev was summoned to serve as a political commissar, a role that carried significant responsibility for maintaining morale and ideological commitment among the troops of the Red Army. His function was not primarily military in the conventional sense, it was fundamentally psychological. He was tasked with guaranteeing discipline within the ranks, reinforcing communist ideals among soldiers who faced death daily, and vigilantly monitoring the behavior and political reliability of military officers who commanded them. Brezhnev served on several fronts throughout the war, with particular concentration in the Caucasus region and Ukraine. Both areas witnessed intense military activity, characterized by brutal combat, rapid territorial shifts, and enormous casualties on both sides. As a political officer, he accompanied combat operations closely, positioning himself near the action to maintain credibility with the troops. However, his weapon was not the rifle carried by frontline soldiers. His tool was the spoken word, carefully crafted to inspire, intimidate, or reassure as circumstances required. He demonstrated a natural ability to communicate effectively with soldiers from diverse backgrounds. He knew how to exalt Soviet heroism in terms that resonated with ordinary men. He skillfully articulated the fascist threat in ways that made the desperate struggle feel necessary and meaningful. His ability to maintain order during chaotic retreats, to elevate morale during periods of defeat, and to channel the energy of victory into continued effort was recognized and valued by his military and political superiors. This recognition translated into continuous promotions throughout the war years. In a relatively short period, he attained the rank of Major General, an achievement that was particularly notable for someone who lacked traditional military training or experience commanding troops in combat. Beyond the accumulation of titles and decorations, the war offered Brezhnev invaluable direct contact with the functioning of the Soviet state operating in emergency mode. He witnessed firsthand how the massive bureaucratic apparatus adapted to existential crisis. He observed how decisions were made under conditions of extreme pressure, where miscalculation could result not merely in political setbacks, but in military catastrophe and the loss of thousands of lives. He came to understand that in wartime, decisions were based less on ideological purity and more on personal loyalties and the delivery of immediate, measurable results. The conflict also substantially strengthened his connections with military leaders who would occupy influential positions in the post-war period. He forged relationships with figures in the high command of both the army and the party, creating a network that extended beyond his original base in Dnipropetrovsk. Furthermore, the war experience consolidated his fundamentally pragmatic worldview. Brezhnev was not a romantic figure who glorified the battlefield or sought personal heroism through reckless action. He was instead a manager of survival, someone who understood that warfare was ultimately about resource allocation, morale maintenance, and the systematic application of force. He did not allow himself to be carried away by patriotic glory or emotional appeals to sacrifice. Rather, he observed with careful attention the functioning of the chain of command, noting who gave orders and who obeyed. He studied the use of propaganda as an instrument of control, recognizing how carefully constructed narratives could motivate men to advance into machine gun fire. He internalized the critical importance of discipline as the foundation of military effectiveness. These lessons, learned in the crucible of total war, would profoundly shape his approach to leadership in the decades that followed, reinforcing his natural inclination toward order, stability, and centralized control. In the post-war period, the Soviet Union confronted a landscape of structural devastation, widespread hunger, and profound social instability. Brezhnev was assigned to Moldova, one of the most fragile regions within the newly reorganized Soviet territory. Moldova, recently annexed from Romania following the war's conclusion, presented exceptional complexities. The region was multi-ethnic, with populations that harbored deep distrust toward Moscow. Its economy had been severely weakened by years of conflict and the disruption of traditional trade patterns. Brezhnev's mission in this challenging territory was clearly defined. He was expected to consolidate Soviet control over a population that had not chosen to join the USSR. He was tasked with promoting economic reconstruction in an area that lacked basic infrastructure. The challenge proved enormous because the local population actively resisted the centralizing policies being imposed from the Kremlin. Many residents remembered their previous Romanian administration with nostalgia, regardless of its actual merits. They viewed Soviet rule as foreign occupation rather than liberation. Brezhnev adopted an approach that emphasized pragmatism over rigid ideological application. Unlike other regional leaders who immediately resorted to harsh measures, he avoided implementing brutal methods of repression from the outset. He understood that excessive violence would only deepen resistance, making his task more difficult in the long term. Instead, he sought to project an image of stability, competence, and reasonable authority. Even while dealing with protests that occasionally erupted in towns and villages, with acts of sabotage against Soviet installations, and with persistent passive resistance from local officials who delayed implementation of Moscow's directives, he maintained a relatively measured public posture. He invested available resources in public works projects that provided visible improvements to daily life. He launched agricultural campaigns designed to increase food production. He built an administrative structure focused on achieving concrete, measurable results that could be reported to his superiors in Moscow as evidence of success. Nevertheless, repression was not completely avoided, nor could it be given the nature of Soviet governance. Brezhnev approved operations aimed at political control, including the arrest of individuals identified as opponents of Soviet authority. He strengthened the apparatus of state surveillance, ensuring that the security services maintained comprehensive files on potential troublemakers. He understood through years of experience that loyalty to the party sometimes required firmness when persuasion proved insufficient to achieve compliance. However, his difference from more brutal administrators lay in his methodology. He preferred to consolidate power gradually, avoiding dramatic confrontations that would attract attention from Moscow or generate martyrs around whom opposition could coalesce. He sought to achieve control with the minimum possible noise. In Moldova, this combination of discipline tempered by pragmatic calculation functioned as a laboratory where he could refine the methods he would later apply on a national scale when he reached the summit of Soviet power. The food crisis presented another crucial test of his administrative capabilities. Amid severe scarcity that threatened to provoke widespread unrest, Brezhnev organized agricultural campaigns specifically designed to increase local production, despite working with severely limited resources. He understood that hunger bred political discontent more effectively than any opposition propaganda. He promoted material incentives for peasants who exceeded production quotas, a departure from the purely coercive methods that had characterized earlier collectivization campaigns. He applied sustained pressure on bureaucrats to meet established targets, using a combination of encouragement and veiled threats. Importantly, he avoided resorting initially to the massive violence that had been typical of the Stalinist era, when millions had died in forced collectivization and artificial famines. His focus on stability and efficiency was beginning to crystallize into a coherent philosophy of governance. He believed that Soviet power could be maintained more effectively through competent administration and selective repression rather than through constant terror. Moscow was observing his performance with considerable attention. Senior party figures noted that Brezhnev delivered results without creating problems that required intervention from the center. This reputation for reliable, quiet effectiveness would serve as a foundation for his continued rise through the Soviet hierarchy. Following his efficient performance in Moldova, Brezhnev was transferred to Kazakhstan, where he established a close working relationship with Nikita Khrushchev, the emerging protagonist of Soviet politics in the post-Stalin era. Khrushchev perceived in Brezhnev a reliable ally who possessed genuine administrative talent while displaying no visible personal ambitions that might threaten his own position. This perception proved crucial because it allowed Brezhnev to move through the upper echelons of power without generating suspicion among rival factions. He did not present himself as a potential threat to anyone's position. He simply fulfilled whatever tasks were assigned to him with competence and without complaint. This reputation for dependable mediocrity, carefully cultivated, served as protective camouflage. During the Virgin Lands campaign, one of Khrushchev's signature initiatives, Brezhnev was summoned to lead the agricultural colonization of previously unexploited regions throughout Kazakhstan. The project was extraordinarily ambitious, heavily laden with ideological significance beyond its practical goals. Khrushchev envisioned it as a demonstration of Soviet agricultural prowess, a campaign that would expand grain production dramatically while proving the superiority of the Soviet model over capitalist agriculture. Brezhnev assumed this challenging mission with characteristic organizational efficiency. He supervised the massive logistical operation required to send hundreds of thousands of workers to remote regions. He oversaw the construction of infrastructure in areas that lacked even basic amenities. He monitored progress toward established targets, applying pressure where necessary to ensure that reported achievements matched Moscow's expectations. Despite confronting substantial technical obstacles, including inadequate machinery, harsh environmental conditions, including drought and extreme temperatures, and chronic shortages of essential supplies, he managed to present concrete advances that satisfied his patron. The long-term sustainability of these achievements was questionable, but the immediate political benefits were undeniable. During this period in Kazakhstan, his relationship with Khrushchev strengthened considerably beyond their initial connection. Brezhnev was included in meetings dedicated to strategic planning at the highest levels. He participated in decisions that affected policy at the national scale rather than merely regional matters. He secured positions on key party committees where important decisions were debated and ratified. He gradually transformed into a bridge figure, connecting the old cadres who had risen under Stalin with the new technocrats who were gaining influence in the post-war period. He demonstrated flexibility in his thinking, avoiding rigid dogmatic positions that might alienate either group. He developed an acute sense of timing, understanding when to speak in meetings to demonstrate competence, but more importantly, when to remain silent and allow others to take credit or blame. His apparent unwavering loyalty, combined with his refined ability to avoid becoming entangled in factional conflicts, made him an invaluable ally to Khrushchev. However, he was simultaneously an attentive observer of power dynamics in full transformation, carefully noting who gained influence, who lost it, and why. Behind the public facade of loyal service, Brezhnev began systematically constructing his own network of support, independent of Khrushchev's patronage. He reactivated contacts from the Dnipropetrovsk mafia, those loyal allies who had accompanied him since the 1930s. He discreetly placed trusted associates in strategically important positions throughout the party bureaucracy, the economic ministries, and regional administrations. He cultivated the respect and goodwill of military officers, recognizing that the armed forces would play a decisive role in any future political confrontation. He accomplished all of this without openly challenging Khrushchev, who remained the dominant figure in Soviet politics throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. Brezhnev's approach constituted a meticulous political dance, one requiring extraordinary patience and self-control. He projected an image of absolute fidelity to his patron while simultaneously preparing, gradually and almost imperceptibly, his own independent base of power. His objective was not a direct, dramatic rupture that would force others to choose sides prematurely. Instead, he pursued a calculated, incremental expansion of influence that would position him to act decisively when circumstances became favorable. He understood that in Soviet politics, premature ambition was fatal, but the complete absence of ambition meant permanent subordination. In 1964, Khrushchev's leadership began to crumble under intense internal criticism directed at his erratic management style. His reforms were widely regarded as hasty, poorly planned, and disruptive to established institutional interests. Brezhnev, who had been perceived until that moment as merely a loyal companion without independent political ambitions, acted with almost surgical precision when the opportunity presented itself. He secured the backing of crucial power centers, including the High Military Command, the KGB security apparatus, and veteran party officials who had grown increasingly frustrated with Khrushchev's unpredictability. Together, they organized a transition that was remarkably silent, given the magnitude of the political shift. There was no violent coup involving tanks in the streets or dramatic arrests. Instead, the removal was carefully planned, meticulously executed within established bureaucratic frameworks to maintain an appearance of institutional legitimacy. Khrushchev was removed from power under the official pretext of health concerns, a face-saving formula that avoided the need for public accusations or trials. Brezhnev emerged from this carefully orchestrated transition as the new General Secretary of the Communist Party, the most powerful position in the Soviet system. His ascension to the pinnacle of Soviet power came accompanied by a clear, unambiguous proposal that resonated with exhausted elites. He offered stability. After enduring years of turbulent reforms that had disrupted careers, threatened institutional prerogatives, and created widespread anxiety about the future, he promised continuity and predictability. These were values that appealed profoundly to a power structure that had been shaken repeatedly by dramatic policy shifts. His leadership was initially presented as collegial in nature, with power formally shared among several figures, including Alexei Kosygin, who held the position of premier and managed day-to-day economic policy. However, in actual practice, it was Brezhnev who set the pace of strategic decisions, who determined which issues reached the agenda, and who ultimately held veto power over major initiatives. His style differed markedly from Khrushchev's theatrical approach. He was less given to dramatic gestures or bold pronouncements. However, his leadership proved far more controlled, more methodical in its exercise of authority. Brezhnev established a new political logic that would define Soviet governance for nearly 2 decades. There would be no grand reforms that might destabilize existing arrangements. There would be no sudden policy reversals that left officials scrambling to adjust. There would be no surprises that might threaten the comfortable positions of the nomenklatura. He systematically reversed portions of the decentralizing measures that Khrushchev had implemented, measures that had threatened the power of central party organs. He reinforced the authority of the party apparatus over the constituent Soviet republics, ensuring that Moscow's control remained unchallenged. Internally, he restored what might be called a cult of stability itself. Gradually, this evolved into a carefully managed cult surrounding his own figure. Posters bearing his image began appearing in public spaces. Busts were commissioned for prominent institutions. Official ceremonies included increasingly elaborate tributes to his leadership. Nevertheless, his public image was maintained within relatively moderate bounds, especially in the early years. Unlike Stalin, who had demanded absolute worship, or Khrushchev, who had cultivated a folksy populism, Brezhnev preferred to project power through permanence rather than through dramatic gestures or ideological fervor. This policy of containment and stability enjoyed considerable support from the general population initially. Ordinary Soviet citizens saw in him a symbol of order, after enduring decades marked first by Stalinist terror, then by Khrushchev's unsettling unpredictability. The economy continued growing throughout the 1960s, driven largely by high energy prices and continued industrialization. Living standards improved slowly but perceptibly. Consumer goods became somewhat more available. Housing construction proceeded at a substantial pace. The general atmosphere was one of normalcy, a quality that held genuine appeal after years of upheaval. However, this apparent equilibrium concealed a system that was already showing unmistakable signs of structural deterioration. Industrial growth was slowing. Technological innovation lagged behind the West. Agricultural production remained chronically inadequate despite massive investments. Corruption was becoming endemic throughout the bureaucracy. Nevertheless, Brezhnev demonstrated considerable skill in managing expectations. He understood that as long as the system continued functioning at an acceptable level, as long as the population remained relatively satisfied with gradual improvements in material conditions, and as long as no major crisis forced a confrontation with underlying problems, his position would remain secure. Stability, even if purchased at the cost of stagnation, became both his promise and his legacy. Beginning in the 1970s, the Soviet economy started losing momentum in ways that became increasingly difficult to ignore. The first clear indicators of deceleration appeared with declining agricultural productivity, despite decades of investment and repeated campaigns to boost output. Excessive bureaucracy strangled initiative at every level of economic activity. Chronic inefficiency plagued state-owned industries that operated without meaningful competition or accountability. Faced with these mounting challenges, Brezhnev opted to preserve the existing model rather than undertake necessary reforms. He avoided any course of action that might entail political risk to his position or to the comfortable arrangements that benefited the party elite. His leadership style prioritized stability above all other considerations, even when that stability came at the direct expense of economic progress. The governing principle was unmistakable. The system must be kept functioning, even if that meant accepting a glacially slow pace of development that would inevitably allow the West to pull further ahead. This approach to governance eventually became known as the period of stagnation, a term that Soviet citizens themselves would later employ with bitter irony to describe the Brezhnev years. The highly centralized economic structure grew increasingly rigid over time, becoming progressively incapable of adapting to the challenges posed by a rapidly modernizing world. Technological innovations that might have improved productivity became trapped in endless bureaucratic procedures, requiring approvals from multiple levels of authority. Talent and merit ceased to be primary criteria for advancement. Instead, promotion throughout the system came to depend almost entirely on demonstrated loyalty to superiors and careful adherence to established procedures. Corruption began to be tolerated, even normalized, provided it did not threaten the overall equilibrium of the system or challenge the privileges of those at the top. What emerged was a model where maintaining the appearance of functionality mattered far more than achieving concrete results. Factories reported meeting production quotas even when their output was shoddy or unusable. Agricultural collectives fabricated harvest figures. Economic statistics became exercises in creative accounting designed to satisfy Moscow rather than to reflect reality. Brezhnev's personal leadership style reinforced this debilitating dynamic throughout the system. He rewarded loyalty not with challenging assignments or opportunities for meaningful achievement, but with honorary titles, decorative medals, and positions that carried lifetime tenure regardless of performance. Generals who had not won battles, ministers who had not reformed their ministries, and local bureaucrats who had done nothing beyond avoiding scandal all found themselves elevated into a consolidated elite. This privileged class had no incentive whatsoever to renew itself or to challenge arrangements that served their interests. Brezhnev himself accumulated decorations to an absurd degree that became a subject of dark humor among ordinary citizens. He eventually received 16 Hero of the Soviet Union medals, the nation's highest honor, for accomplishments that grew increasingly vague with each bestowal. His government transformed into a symbol of a state that had become bloated beyond functionality, obsessed with empty ceremonial displays, and endlessly repetitive in its rhetoric. The machinery of governance continued to operate, but the gears were rusting even as officials polished the exterior casing. While the fundamental components of the system deteriorated from neglect and obsolescence, the imposing facade remained standing, creating an illusion of permanence. Despite this institutional paralysis, Brezhnev's government offered something that had been remarkably rare throughout Soviet history. It provided predictability. Salaries arrived on schedule, even if their purchasing power gradually eroded. Basic goods remained available in state stores, though quality was poor and selection limited. Ideological conflicts that had torn apart families and communities in earlier decades had been effectively silenced through a combination of repression and exhaustion. The pervasive fear of arbitrary purges that had characterized the Stalin era had receded into memory. An entire generation grew to adulthood under the comfortable illusion that this equilibrium could persist indefinitely, that the Soviet Union had finally achieved a stable form that would endure. For many Soviet citizens, particularly those who remembered the terrors and deprivations of earlier periods, this calm represented a genuine achievement worthy of gratitude. They valued the absence of upheaval even if it came packaged with mediocrity. For others, particularly younger, more educated citizens who compared their circumstances to what they knew of life in the West, this stability felt like imprisonment in a comfortable but confining cell. They recognized that their society was falling behind, that opportunities for genuine achievement were limited, and that the price of security was the surrender of ambition. Nevertheless, Both groups adapted to circumstances they felt powerless to change, creating a society characterized by widespread cynicism, private skepticism coexisting with public conformity, and a pervasive sense that the system would lumber forward indefinitely simply because no alternative seemed possible. During the 1970s, Brezhnev adopted a foreign policy orientation focused on achieving equilibrium with the Western powers, a strategic shift that became known as détente. This period of reduced tensions was characterized by historic agreements that seemed to promise a more stable international order. The Salt-Eye Treaty represented a milestone achievement, establishing limits on the growth of nuclear arsenals possessed by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Brezhnev also participated actively in negotiations that produced the Helsinki Accords, multilateral agreements designed to guarantee fundamental human rights while respecting the territorial borders that had been established following the conclusion of the Second World War. Although the Soviet Union harbored no genuine intention of fully honoring all the commitments contained in these agreements, particularly those concerning human rights and freedom of movement, the public gesture helped consolidate its international image as a rational superpower capable of responsible diplomacy. The Cold War continued unabated beneath the surface, but a diplomatic truce created space for negotiation and reduced the immediate risk of nuclear catastrophe. For Brezhnev personally, détente represented a calculated strategy designed to guarantee Soviet security without requiring any renunciation of fundamental ideological rivalry with the capitalist West. He viewed it as a temporary accommodation rather than a permanent settlement. Simultaneously, he pursued an aggressive campaign to expand Soviet influence throughout the developing world, providing substantial support to socialist movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Soviet Union backed liberation movements, provided military advisors, shipped weapons, and offered economic assistance to regimes that aligned themselves with Moscow. However, this expansionist approach carried enormous economic costs that strained an already inefficient Soviet economy. It required increasingly complex interventions in distant regions where local conditions were poorly understood. Soviet diplomacy began showing signs of exhaustion, particularly as tensions increased in inherently unstable regions where Cold War competition intersected with local conflicts rooted in ethnic, religious, or historical grievances. The external balance was maintained through these years, but only at the cost of tremendous financial effort and mounting resistance from the capitalist bloc, which responded with its own programs of support for anti-Soviet forces. The decisive breaking point arrived with the invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. The decision to commit Soviet military forces to this mountainous country was driven primarily by fear of losing influence throughout strategically vital Central Asia. Soviet leaders worried that an Islamic government in Afghanistan might inspire similar movements in the Muslim-majority Soviet republics. However, the invasion produced disastrous consequences that far exceeded anything anticipated by its architects. The United States immediately suspended strategic agreements that had been painstakingly negotiated over years. It organized a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympic Games, denying the Soviet Union an important propaganda opportunity. American policy shifted decisively toward a more aggressive posture in the Cold War, with increased military spending and support for anti-Soviet forces worldwide. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, found itself trapped in a conflict without any clear exit strategy. It faced a persistent guerrilla resistance that proved impossible to defeat through conventional military operations. These resistance fighters received sophisticated weapons and substantial financial support from Washington, which saw Afghanistan as an opportunity to inflict on the Soviets the same kind of prolonged, demoralizing conflict that America had experienced in Vietnam. The Afghan War became precisely that, the Soviet Vietnam. It was lengthy, extraordinarily costly in both financial and human terms, and increasingly unpopular among Soviet citizens who questioned why their sons were dying in a distant land. Domestically, Brezhnev's legitimacy, which had rested largely on his promise of stability, began crumbling as casualty reports arrived and economic conditions deteriorated. Concurrently, The international image of the Soviet Union suffered severe damage across multiple dimensions. The official discourse emphasizing moral leadership and social progress no longer convinced international audiences who had access to information about Soviet realities. Persistent violations of human rights, pervasive censorship that stifled intellectual life, and the brutal treatment of dissidents generated constant international criticism that Soviet propaganda could not effectively counter. The Eastern European satellite states, which had appeared submissive for decades, began displaying unmistakable signs of discontent that threatened Soviet hegemony over the region. Poland witnessed the emergence of Solidarity, an independent trade union that rapidly evolved into a mass movement challenging Communist Party control. Similar stirrings appeared elsewhere behind the Iron Curtain. Soviet influence continued to exist formally, supported by military occupation and the threat of intervention. However, in practice, that influence eroded steadily, day after day. The soft power that the Soviet Union had once wielded through its claim to represent the future of human development simply evaporated as the reality of Soviet life became more widely known. Meanwhile, the hard power represented by military force and economic leverage demanded a price that the country was no longer in any condition to pay. The Soviet economy was stagnating, its technological base was falling further behind the West, its population was becoming cynical and disengaged. The system that Brezhnev had worked so carefully to preserve was beginning to fracture under pressures both internal and external. In his final years of life, Leonid Brezhnev became the living personification of Soviet immobilism, already severely weakened by multiple health problems, including heart disease, emphysema, and the effects of stroke, yet surrounded by a protective circle of loyal allies who benefited from his continued presence in power. He adamantly refused to relinquish his position. His government passed increasingly into the hands of committees and personal secretaries who managed daily affairs while invoking his authority. Brezhnev himself appeared only at carefully staged ceremonial events where his limitations could be minimized through meticulous preparation. He stammered through speeches written by others, frequently losing his place in the text. He fell asleep during important meetings with foreign dignitaries, creating embarrassing moments that Soviet media worked desperately to conceal. He required physical support simply to stand at podiums or walk short distances without stumbling. Despite these obvious incapacities that would have prompted resignation in almost any other political system, he was maintained in office as a symbol of continuity. He had become essentially a living statue, venerated in propaganda, but disconnected from actual governance. The Soviet leadership had transformed into a gerontocracy where elderly men clung to power long past their capacity to exercise it effectively. Remarkably, despite the evident stagnation that characterized his later years, Brezhnev retained substantial popularity among significant segments of the Soviet population, particularly older citizens who formed his core base of support. For many in this demographic, he was remembered with genuine affection as the leader who had guaranteed decades of peace following the catastrophic losses of World War II. They credited him with making housing more accessible through massive construction programs that had moved millions from communal apartments into private family units. They valued the predictable social life his era had provided, where one knew what to expect from year to year without the terrifying upheavals that had characterized earlier Soviet history. The stability he represented, however stultifying it might appear to others, held real value for people whose lives had been marked by trauma. However, for younger generations who had no personal memory of Stalinist terror or wartime devastation, his image was entirely different. They saw him as a hopelessly outdated bureaucrat, fundamentally disconnected from the modern world and its challenges. He embodied everything that frustrated them about Soviet society: the resistance to change, the privileging of seniority over merit, the suffocating conformity, the technological backwardness. Institutional respect for his position coexisted uneasily with widespread boredom and cynicism about what he represented. The Soviet Union under his leadership had become an empire that no longer inspired its own citizens or impressed international observers. It merely resisted collapse through institutional inertia and the absence of any mechanism for peaceful change. Brezhnev died in November 1982, finally releasing his grip on power only through death itself. He left behind a governmental structure that was monumentally heavy, bureaucratically inflated and fundamentally exhausted. His immediate successor, Yuri Andropov, inherited a country that stood on the edge of systemic collapse. Though this reality was not yet fully apparent to outside observers, who continued to regard the Soviet Union as a formidable superpower, Andropov possessed a clearer understanding of the depth of Soviet problems than his predecessor had been willing to acknowledge. However, he enjoyed only a narrow margin for introducing genuine reforms. The same entrenched bureaucracy that had kept Brezhnev in power long past his effectiveness now resisted changes that might threaten comfortable arrangements. Andropov's own health failed rapidly, denying him the time necessary to redirect Soviet trajectory, even had he possessed the political strength to overcome resistance. The legacy of Brezhnev would be debated intensely for decades following his death, particularly as the Soviet Union itself disintegrated less than a decade after his passing. Assessments of his leadership divided sharply along generational, ideological, and national lines. For some observers and citizens, particularly those who had lived through his era, he deserved recognition as a guardian of peace who had avoided the nuclear catastrophe that often seemed imminent during the Cold War. They credited him with maintaining Soviet power and prestige during a difficult period, with improving material conditions for ordinary citizens, and with providing the stability that allowed a traumatized society to recover from earlier upheavals. For others, particularly those who witnessed the Soviet collapse and who believed reform might have prevented it, Brezhnev was the architect of paralysis. They argued that his refusal to address fundamental economic problems, his suppression of necessary debate, his promotion of incompetent loyalists, and his resistance to technological modernization had doomed the Soviet system. They saw in his tenure the lost opportunity to reform communism before it became unreformable, to address problems while solutions remained possible. This debate over his legacy reflected deeper arguments about whether the Soviet system could have been saved through timely reform, or whether its contradictions made collapse inevitable, regardless of leadership decisions. Brezhnev himself likely never contemplated such questions. He had devoted his career to preserving Soviet power as he understood it, maintaining stability as he valued it, and protecting his own position as circumstances required. Whether history would judge him as a stabilizing force or a stagnant obstacle mattered less to him than the immediate task of managing the present without disruption. Leonid Brezhnev was simultaneously the pillar of Soviet stability and the unwitting architect of its stagnation. He governed for nearly 2 decades without experiencing internal wars or major revolutionary upheavals that might have fractured the state. Yet this same period was characterized by an absence of genuine progress, a failure to address mounting structural problems that would eventually prove fatal to the system itself. He was a master at keeping the apparatus functioning, maintaining the illusion of permanence even when the foundation showed unmistakable signs of deterioration. His figure continues to divide historians and political analysts throughout the world, generating sharply contrasting assessments that reflect deeper disagreements about the nature of political leadership and historical causation. Ultimately, the central question remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Did Brezhnev save the Soviet Union by providing the stability necessary for its survival through a difficult period? Or did he merely delay an inevitable collapse while allowing problems to metastasize beyond any possibility of solution? This question invites reflection on fundamental tensions in political leadership. Stability has genuine value, particularly for societies that have experienced trauma and disruption. Brezhnev provided Soviet citizens with predictability, security from arbitrary violence, and gradual improvements in material conditions. These were not trivial achievements, given the horrors of the Stalin era and the chaos of the Khrushchev period. However, stability purchased at the cost of necessary adaptation may ultimately prove more dangerous than managed change. By refusing to confront economic inefficiency, technological backwardness, and political ossification, Brezhnev allowed these problems to compound until they became insurmountable. His successor, Gorbachev, would attempt reforms, but by then the system had become too rigid, and the problems too severe for gradual adjustment. The Soviet Union collapsed not because Gorbachev attempted change, but because decades of avoided decisions under Brezhnev had created conditions where any change triggered systemic failure. The debate over Brezhnev's legacy thus reflects a broader tension between order and progress, between preserving what exists and adapting to what emerges. Some argue that he was precisely the leader the Soviet Union needed during his time, that more aggressive reformers would have triggered crisis prematurely, and that his cautious approach maximized Soviet power and influence for as long as circumstances permitted. Others contend that he represented a tragic missed opportunity, that the 1970s offered a window for managed reform that his leadership squandered, and that his preference for comfortable stagnation over difficult renewal condemned the Soviet experiment to ultimate failure. Neither interpretation can be definitively proven. History does not provide controlled experiments where we can observe what would have occurred under alternative leadership. What remains certain is that Brezhnev shaped Soviet trajectory profoundly through both his actions and his inaction, and that understanding his leadership remains essential for comprehending how the 20th century's great ideological competition ultimately resolved itself.